I've been playing MLB DFS for 7 years, and each year is a different puzzle to solve. As the field improves in some ways and just changes in others, I need to make sure that I'm adjusting my strategy accordingly to maximize my profitability. In this video, I'll break down my top 5 tips for the 2024 season. These are timely, relevant things you can do in your process to beat the MLB DFS games as they are played in 2024. And make sure to stick around until tip number 4, which is the most timely strategy in my entire list, and is an edge you can exploit right now that I promise will not be around for long. Tip number 1 is to build around stacks, but don't overthink it. Stacking is clearly a huge part of MLB DFS strategy. As we add additional hitters from the same team to our lineup, we increase the combined correlation between each hitter and put ourselves in a position for a high score when that team goes off. In past years, I've tried to be the smartest player in the room by trying to play stacks that I felt might be profitable and others were ignoring to try to get different, and what I'm seeing in the 2024 season leads me to believe that that was a leak. All of the top 150 maxers and pros are playing the classic MLB stacks in almost all of their lineups most nights. These are 5-3s, 5-2s, 5-1-1-1s, 4-4, and 4-3 stacks. These are the constructions that let you maximize your correlation the most, and there are so many combinations of these stacks on any given slate that we have plenty of other ways to differentiate ourselves from the field. Shady Advice, one of the top MLB DFS players in the lobby, has mentioned before in the SaberSim Discord that you should be thinking about how to get your fair share of winnings from the bad players in the lobby with your lineups, not trying to come up with ways to outsmart the other sharp players, and this seems like the perfect example of this here. Rather than wasting bankroll trying to see if I can make unconventional stacks work, I'm sticking with the highest correlation stacks and playing as many strong lineups as I can. This season, I'm letting our correlation slider do most of the work with my lineup construction, which automatically will direct you to these most effective stacks. The only thing that I'm doing in my process is eliminating any of the other stack types outside of that group I just mentioned before building lineups. Typically, when I go to build, I'll look at my stack types here and just uncheck everything and then just add in the main 5 stacks that I want to see make up the vast majority of my portfolio most nights. Tip number 2 is to be conservative with weather risk games. Earlier this season, I released an entirely separate video about how I handle weather risk games in MLB DFS, and you can find it linked in the description of this video, but I wanted to stress this point again here. I use Kevin Roth's weather dashboard over on RotoGrinders, and at this point in the season, I am almost completely fading any game with any orange in the color-coded risk. And there's a few reasons why. First, postponement risk, expressed as a part of a player's range of outcomes, is essentially adding X% chance of that player scoring 0, where X is the chance that that game postpones. Expressed this way, weather risk would have a significant impact on a player's projection if projections accounted for postponement risk. Adding in another 25% of outcomes where a player scores 0 points, for example, would drop that player's projection a lot. And it also will make what was their 85th percentile, for example, all of a sudden a 95th percentile outcome. The salaries for individual players set by DFS sites don't have postponement risk baked in, obviously. So you're generally paying an overpriced price for players when they have 25% plus chances to have their games postponed. Second, because the range of outcomes for MLB players is so wide, it is very rare that any player playing in a weather game is truly a must play. It's very easy to find replacement players in games with no weather risk whatsoever to play instead. And don't get me wrong, sometimes the weather risk game is going to play and the stacks are going to go off and they're going to be the team that you needed to win. But in general, given the choice between a stack with a risk of not playing at all versus the field of all of the other stacking options on this slate, give me the field. And finally, the market simply doesn't adjust correctly for these games. It's easy to play mind games with yourself and think, well, if the field all gets off this bad weather game, maybe those stacks will end up under-owned. And it just rarely ends up actually happening that way. Most ownership projection systems don't account for weather concerns, and most players in games with weather risk tend to come in owned at about the rate they were expected for. Any minor ownership discounts you get never actually outweighs the downside risk you took on by playing those teams. You can check out my weather strategy guide in the description of this video for a full breakdown here, but my practical advice this year is to be conservative with weather. I'm Xing out any games with orange in the rating from Kevin Roth. So on this particular slate, it's a pretty easy one, straightforward here. I'm not going to be playing the game that's already been postponed. I'm certainly not going to be playing the game that has orange-red here, but I will also very likely be fading the Rockies and Reds game, which is a perfect example of what I'm talking about here. It doesn't look like this game is a lock to postpone, but there is legitimate suspension or postponement risk, and I'm just not taking that chance on an 11-game slate where there are so many other options. Tip number 3 is to strive to play balanced, game theory optimal portfolios of lineups. The field continues to get sharper every year, and I have noticed now more than ever that ownership is becoming more efficient. Low-owned stacks are coming in at 5% owned instead of 1% owned. The elite pitching option on the slate might be coming in at 55% instead of 40% owned, and in general, it is harder to intentionally exploit inefficient ownership. This doesn't mean you can't take advantage of ownership inefficiencies, but it does mean it is harder to do it intentionally and exploitatively before lock. The inefficient ownership is harder to find pre-lock, but we can let it come to us naturally by playing in a balanced way. Now, this can be a hard concept to grasp, so let me explain with an example here. A favorite strategy of mine in past years was to intentionally fade the chalky, mediocre SP2 that is up against a mediocre team. These pitchers for a long time have garnered a lot more ownership than they probably deserved, generally because average projections and traditional optimizers would overstate their value and jam them into lineups with people using those tools to build their lineups. This would lead to the pitcher being overowned, the stack on the other side being underowned, and I would intentionally try to be well over the field on the opposing stack and sometimes even fully fade the pitcher. Now, this strategy works if and only if your predictions on the ownership are correct. The pitcher, based on the projections, is favored to play well. The stack on the other side is often favored to play poorly. You are only getting paid off for this gamble if you are earning that back by getting ownership leverage in your contest. You have targeted a single leverage opportunity and built a portfolio designed to maximize your ROI if you're right. And if you're wrong, you are going to crater your profitability for that slate. Trust me, I know, because I've done it plenty of times. However, on the flip side, if you strive to play a balanced portfolio, getting exposures to all pitchers and stacks at about the rate you would expect them to be in the winning lineup, you get to soak up all the random ownership inefficiencies on the slate. Let's say the Yankees should be about 10% owned, and then we flip the cards over, and they come in at about 6% owned. And the Astros should have been about 12% owned, and they're 18% owned. And a good pitching option that should have been 21% owned, and he's 17% owned. A balanced portfolio of well-built lineups gets to capitalize on all of these micro inefficiencies in field ownership in a way that an exploitative approach cannot. If I could sum this up in the simplest way, it's that inefficient ownership is becoming harder to predict before the slate starts, which makes me want to build portfolios of lineups that are as resistant to ownership variance as possible and can maximize their profitability for as many different ways the field could play as possible. A big reason why I started playing this way is noticing that the most consistently profitable 150 maxers in the flagship GPP are all doing so. There are definitely still plenty of profitable exploitative players out there that will take big stands, and you'll see them on occasion with by far the most profitable 150 max portfolio on a given slate, where they were able to perfectly predict the inefficient ownership and build a portfolio designed to maximize their ROI for that. But the names you see profitably playing night after night after night in our contest flashback are playing very spread out, balanced sets of lineups. Now, to actually get this done, there are 2 steps here that I follow. The first is I've started to configure my contest sims on SaberSim to be resilient to ownership variance. So not only do I create the contest sim using the expected field for my contest, but I also set up additional contest sims using each one of the different SaberSim field lineups and my build itself to simulate my lineups against. What this does is it grades your lineups in the contest sim using a wider range of possible outcomes for what the field might play. I get to see, for example, if a lineup with a popular pitcher is profitable in versions of the contest where he ends up being 30, 40, 50, or 60% owned. And after running my contest sims, I'll filter out all the lineups that weren't above a 0% ROI in every single contest sim I ran, which means the remaining pool I have left is profitable in as many different potential ways the field might play as possible. Now, I know that's a little bit confusing when I just say it all out loud, so let me actually walk through it step by step for this slate so you can see exactly what I do. So what I'm going to do here first is create a contest sim for the contest that I'm playing. In the contest tab, I'm going to add a contest sim. For this, I'm actually going to change my ownership here projections to the flagship MME because I'm going to create this contest for all of these different sets of field lineups I have. So I'll go ahead and create that there. Now I'm going to just do it again. This time I'm going to make it for the 20 max. This time I'm going to do it again, and I'm going to make it for the flagship single entry. I'm going to go through and follow these steps and add a contest sim for this version of all of these different field lineups. Now, what I am basically saying is, yes, I'm playing the Minimax, and the Minimax has this payout structure, and SaberSim believes more than likely that the field lineups of the Minimax are going to resemble what we think the low-stakes MME are going to do here. But I know there's variance here, and I want to be careful attacking that variance and making sure my lineups are resilient to that variance. So I want to make sure I play lineups that are profitable against all of these different types of fields. One way to get a really good sense of what's actually going on here is to change the ownership projection source and look at how the ownership projections change for each of these. So by default, the low stakes MME field is what would have been used for the contest sim. We see Chris Sale at about 27%, Max Scherzer at about 23.5%. So when we would go to simulate these lineups, we would see how these lineups would perform if these ownerships were exactly what we got in the contest. But by going and adding all of the different contest sims with different field lineups in each of them, we also get to see what happens if those players end up 27 and 24% owned, 26 and 24% owned, 28 and 24% owned. We see them at 28 and 24. We see them at 33 and 26. We see them at 25 and 23. And we also get to take into account what if our build that we just built was actually more representative of the ownership. So again, that one's actually pretty close. We see them at 25 and 25% here. Now, there are different slates where these numbers differ more or less depending on how the field lineups ultimately shake out. I've seen big discrepancies here, which to me indicates that our range of outcomes for ownership is very wide on what might happen. This slate, at least for those two players, is a little more narrow, but that's okay. There are other players in the pool where the ownership projections will differ by quite a bit more as you change these. The main point here is you're getting ownership variance baked into the build. The one other thing I'll show you here is I do typically like to rename two of these contest sims. The one is the real field, which is the one that matches up to the one that SaberSim originally recommended, which in this case is low stakes MME. That'll be important for one of my next tips here, so I like to specifically call that one out. All I'm saying here to clarify is that when we originally created the field lineups for this contest sim, when we originally created the settings, the low stakes MME field lineups were the ones that SaberSim wanted us to use. So I want to identify that here. And then the one other one I like to look at here is self-sim, which is each of your lineups being simulated against your pool as the field lineups here. This one stands out as being unique because it's ultimately the one I like to sort by. So I like to target that one as well and rename that as well. Now that all those contest sims are configured, all we need to do is run the contest sim, which is going to take all of our lineups, each one of our 5,000 here, and put it in a version of the contest where we get all of these different potential field lineups, and we'll get to see how those lineups score out and how they look against all of these different possible fields. Once all of these sims are complete, you'll see them all show up here in the sorting method. The next step is to filter out lineups. So I will go in and I will add a filter and say that my lineups to play them tonight need to be profitable against all of these different fields. So I will add a filter saying only show lineups where the ROI in the first sim is greater than 0, then going to the second one, which needs to be greater than 0, then going to the third one, which needs to be greater than 0, and so on until I've added those filters for every contest sim that I ran. Now that all of those filters are set, we've filtered out every lineup that isn't profitable in all of the different contest sims we ran. The next step here is to sort, and I like to sort at lock by self-sim. I found that this is the best sorting method to give you that balanced approach. This just generally will make you take a little bit less extreme stands in your lineups here, and it just does a good job of making sure your exposures end up looking very balanced here. Then the second step from here is to diversify with min uniques. If you've watched some of my other content, you've probably heard this before, but I continue to set my min uniques to one less than the maximum I can, while still getting the number of lineups I need for my entries that night, which forces the lineups I ultimately take with me into my contest to be different from one another, and it helps avoid a situation where I end up heavily over or underexposed to any given team or player. To do this, once you have filtered and sorted correctly, all you need to do is stress test the min uniques and see where does it break. I need 150 lineups to max the mini-max, so where's the number where that ends up being too many? If I go to 5, I'm good. If I go to 6, I don't have enough lineups here, so 5 is my maximum. For this slate, I would set my min uniques at 4. Now, we take a quick look over at some of our exposures. You'll see we start to end up with really balanced exposures on our individual players and also on our individual stacks. We are very spread out here, and our lineup exposure generally tends to resemble the pool exposure more or less here. So we're playing a very balanced approach, we're playing a very balanced portfolio, and this lets us attack all of the different ownership inefficiencies as the slate plays out. Now, while this isn't a perfect implementation of a game theory optimal approach, and it certainly isn't the skeleton key to MLB DFS, I found that this exact approach is leading to me playing diversified portfolios of lineups that I really like each night, and it's consistently landed me as one of the top maxers by ROI in the contest that I play in our contest flashback tool. Now, tip number 4 is to incorporate live data into your lineups via late swap. Now, this is a very new edge in the DFS space that the vast majority of players have not yet caught on to, and I want to take advantage of it while it's here. On SaberSim, when you kick off a late swap build using this button in the upper left, you are not only rebuilding your lineups to account for any new player scratches or confirmed starting lineups that have come out since lock, but our contest sims on your potential late swap options also take into account current player performance and the actual lineups you're competing against in your contests. And while you can't add or remove players from your lineups who are already in game, the information about how well they are playing and exactly how owned they are in your contest can help influence the best ways to rebuild that lineup to maximize its EV for the rest of the slate. When you do these late swaps, we take each original lineup that you played, we build a few dozen potential swap options for each lineup, and then we calculate the ROI of each possible swap based on how the players who are already in game are performing and their exact ownership in your contests. Now, this is an oversimplified analogy, but it is like most of your opponents are sitting down to play poker. They're looking at their 2 cards and then deciding how they're going to play the rest of the hand with just that information alone. When you late swap and run mid-slate contest sims on SaberSim, you are adjusting your strategy as you're getting new information at the flop, the turn, and the river as these games are playing out. Now, this one is the most time-sensitive tip on this entire list, and I could very easily see that by the 2025 season, this kind of late swap strategy will be far more popular and come with a diminished return for exploiting it. When it comes to my lineups, not only am I running late swaps to remove players that aren't in the lineup or get scratched for these West Coast games like I have always done, but I am also incorporating additional late swaps throughout the slate, even if there's been no additional confirmed starting lineups or player scratches that have come out, to try to take advantage of the information we have during the slate that we don't at lock. I think the midpoint of the slate is a great balance between having a lot of information you didn't have at lock, while also having enough games left in the slate that you have flexibility in your lineups to act on that information. So in addition to swapping when I have players that are out, I also run one late swap build at the midpoint of every slate to incorporate this live data and maximize my lineup ROI for the remaining games. So let's talk about how I would do this for this particular slate. Obviously, this isn't actually happening right now, but let's assume that the slate is going on here. So I've created a late swap build here by clicking this button and then late swap one contest. The other thing I like to do ahead of the slate locking is figure out about where that swap is going to come. This slate's a little tricky because it doesn't split itself perfectly even. We have these 3 games starting at 6:10. I would probably try for a swap either right before this round of 3 games starts or potentially right before the 7:40 night games start here, or maybe doing both of those to account for this information. So just to be clear about what's actually going on here, if we were to run this swap before the 6:10 games, even if no other starting lineups have come out, we now know after about an hour how the players in these 3 games are performing, and we can swap lineups with that information. We might have, for example, a situation where Boston, with almost a 6-run total, has 0 runs through 4 innings or so, and Boston lineups need to swap into some riskier plays to win back some min-cash equity. Or maybe we have a situation where the national stacks are going off at really low ownership, and your national stacks lineups can swap into higher projected plays the rest of the slate. We also know the exact ownership of the players in those games. SaberSim will incorporate that automatically when you run your contest sim. So if any of the ownership predictions were off or the ownership projections were off pre-lock, we can now fix that using the real ownership that we actually have from the players in those games and make sure the lineups are still balanced correctly with the right amount of ownership to be successful on the slate. So when you're actually doing this here, when you come in, you'll want to first just re-edit 2 player projections here. And then the one other thing that I like to do is make sure my swaps per lineup is as large as possible. You can make this number basically as big as you can where pool size is still 5,000 lineups or left. So for a 5,000 lineups or less. So for a 150 max contest here, you can have 33 swaps per lineup, which means we're going to get 33 new versions of the original lineups we played here. And we can grade those out to find what is the most profitable. When we click build, it's going to rebuild the lineups around any players who have already locked, give us 33 new options, and then we can rerun a contest sim, which is where we incorporate the live data to find the most profitable swap for each lineup that is available to us. Now that our lineups are rebuilt, or we have the new swap options available here, this is where the renaming of the contest sims becomes a little bit valuable here. In this case, we want to start incorporating the real lineups our opponents are playing. So we want to run a contest sim that is correctly associated to low stakes MME, which this is a low stakes MME contest. As long as use live sims if available and use live field lineups if available are checked, we will be pulling in that live data when we run the contest sim. They are checked by default, but just a good thing to keep in mind and be aware of here. So now we only really care about the real field, because at this point we have a lot of information. Let's say it's the 6:10 or the 7:38 swap here. We have a lot of information about what's going on in the slate already. We can just turn off all of the other contest sims and just check the one contest sim that we actually want to use and rerun that contest sim. Now, if this was a live late swap, we would be taking each swap option we have here, using the information we have about how players are performing in-game and the real lineups you're competing against in your contests, and simulating out each swap option to find the most profitable version we can swap to. So we're taking all of the information at our disposal at a midpoint in the slate and re-finding the most profitable swaps here in our lineups. Once the contest sim is complete, all we need to do here now is sort by the ROI, which will give us the most profitable lineups here for the remainder of the slate. And I do tend to like to change min uniques back to whatever I had it before lock, which in this case is 4, and then we can go ahead and get these entered into DraftKings. And finally, last but not least, tip number 5 is to simply play more slates. I've been branching out into night slates, turbos, and MLB showdown contests as much as possible this season. The main idea here is to reduce variance by spreading out my action into less correlated slates. If I drop $500 into an MLB main slate, it's easy to just be wrong on one game and have that totally sink my results for the entire slate. On the other hand, if I spread that same $500 across the main slate, the turbos, the night slates, the showdowns, my action in each slate is less correlated to the action on other slates, and it's more like playing $500 over the course of a few days, but instead packing that into one day. For example, that one game that might have sunk me on the main slate might not even be on the turbo and the night slates. It's certainly not going to be on any more than just one of the showdowns, so I'm still very live in those contests and I have an opportunity to make profit on those other slates. This lets me get more shots on goal over the course of the season and dramatically helps to reduce the swings of variance. Our contest flashback tool was the main driving force for me feeling confident in making this move this season for 2 reasons. First, I can now directly see that my process is profitable in small turbos and night slates as well as MLB Showdown contests. And this is one of the hardest parts of DFS. Knowing whether or not you're actually playing well, knowing that losing most slates is the expected result either way. But a contest simulator that can identify how profitably you played regardless of your results on a given slate makes me feel confident in entering these slates and contests regularly. I dabbled with these contests in the past, but this confidence has let me make this a cornerstone of my contest selection this season. And second, Contest Flashback has made it very clear to me how much harder it is to compete at the above $3 entry fee level on the main slates. Because top pros are restricted from entering contests under $3, we've long recommended players focus on the low stakes first. But Contest Flashback lets us see how big of a difference it really is. A great example of this is comparing a sub $3 single entry contest in Flashback versus a medium stakes single entry contest in Flashback and looking at what the top ROI players look like. The peak possible ROI in the low stakes is much higher than the higher stakes, and it becomes a lot harder to be profitable in contests over $3 entry fees, knowing that top players are taking up so much of the equity. There are so many good lineups comparatively in the high stakes that no one player can have a very high ROI. Whereas in the low stakes, there are so many bad lineups, it's very easy for good players to have a very high expected ROI. And for me personally, to get enough action down on a given day of baseball, I would need to make the jump above $3 on the main slate to get enough action. So rather than try to go to battle against the best players at those stakes, I've preferred to spread my action out in the lower stakes across all of the different MLB slates in a given day, getting to play easier competition and in a lower variance way. This overall is just a win-win to me. Now, as a longtime avid fan of MLB DFS, each year I play, I try to make sharp adjustments to my strategy to maximize my profit for the way the games are and the tools that are available to me that season. So let's sum up my top 5 tips for MLB DFS in 2024. First, maximize your correlation with hitting stacks, but don't overthink the specific constructions. Second, be conservative with games with any weather postponement risk. Third, play balanced GTO portfolios of lineups as opposed to playing exploitatively. Fourth, lead swap your lineups to take advantage of real-time live data from the games and DFS contests in addition to swapping like normal when players are out. And fifth, spread out your action into more slates and game types on a given day of baseball. Now, my strategies about weather, late swap, and MLB Showdown have a lot to break down, enough so that I've recorded entire other strategy guides going deep into how I strategize for these particular parts of the game. I recommend watching all 3 of these videos to make sure you're fully prepared to put these game plans into action for your next MLB slate. And make sure to subscribe to get a notification every time I drop a new video. I'll see you in the next one.